So absolutely, I'm with you.
You know, there's a connector thread that I want to ask all of you about in what you're saying. You referenced General Hyten in your remarks, and I was at that breakfast, and it was striking that he was not bemoaning the technology, but the bureaucracy. You mentioned General Nakasone mentioning some of the same thing. You're all talking about this need to make an adjustment, and it's an argument we've heard for years. Given what we've seen from China, given that there's so much agreement about this from the generals, from private sector, from the civilian side, help us all understand why it's been so hard to make that shift given the consensus that it needs to happen, and that we're seeing adversaries like China make that adjustment with real effect.
All right, let me jump in here. So people create bureaucracy. Right? So at the heart of this, I think, is changing our culture. And I know many of you know, culture eats strategy for breakfast every day, right? Your culture is so important. We don't spend enough time talking about that. We don't spend enough time actually working on that to get to a mindset that, hey, I don't have to build this myself. You know, that not invented here still exists. Our worlds today, especially, I have a lot of experience from the intelligence community. We live in a classified world there as compared to the unclassified world. We're afraid of the unclassified world. We have to overcome that. And my final point would be foot stomping that whole risk taking. But that's part of our culture, and changing that and empowering people. All right, that's an overused word. Rewarding people for taking risk. And if you want to use the word fail fast and learn quickly, go for it.
And how do you reward in government? How do you reward in a system that, by its very design, doesn't incentivize in that way?
Yeah, you have to actually throw that system away and start over. Adopt what's working in the startup community for the reward of being able to fail fast and move more quickly. Clearly, we have figured that out in parts of our world, so adopt that and actually institute that and execute that. Just do it, as we were talking about earlier, on the inside.
Change of the largest organization in the world, 3 million people, is going to be hard. So it's not enough for some of the leaders to say that. This has to be driven consistently by the leadership, secretary on down, and then working with Congress. So I think Teresa is absolutely right about this. We have to start celebrating accomplishment of objectives. And the Pentagon, unfortunately, because it is a risk-averse environment designed to scale up with minimizing some of the risk, is about rules and process. So you have to break that and celebrate the accomplishment of the objectives, not just following the rules. Today, that's what is rewarded. I followed the rules. I couldn't have screwed up because there's a very long process and I followed every step. That's not going to work in competing with China.
I think that there's an interesting way to look at it. I'm always fascinated by the focus on 2 things, spending and announcements. Neither one of those are actual results. If I could encourage anyone, the only thing that actually matters is what you did. Did you have an impact? Was it used by somebody in a way that was going to change the mission for the better? An announcement and spending money is not a sign of success, right? Those are not the things that we should be incentivizing as the primary drivers. It is about putting something into people's hands. I don't love the over-fascination with demonstrations because I think it creates an event in which we look too much at bringing people together to create media and marketing buzz. At the end of the day, who cares? I want to make sure that we're making an impact to the people who need us the most. And we have to do that and focus on that and do it far faster. And again, there's 2 words that I just can't get out of my head here. Courage and disruption. Not innovation. No, not innovation. I hate that word. I consider it to be one of the most toothless words that we can use because it's a place we're going to head. It's not an end. But we need to disrupt and do it now.
I want to go back to something that Teresa said about the fact that a lot of the technology that government and DoD specifically depend on come out of the private sector, that they're no longer the driving force in terms of technological development. From where you sit, how much has that then shaped or forced government to adjust? How can government sort of maintain its technological edge when it's no longer leading the development of the technology itself. As you point out, Chris, that this is shifting towards software, and yet the bureaucracy itself is not shifting towards software, which means it's depending on solutions coming outside of government. How does it then sustain that technological edge when it's not part of the origins of that very technology?
Go ahead.
Sure. I think about it in a couple of very fundamental things that I think of a lot around the infrastructure and plumbing that are going to allow and create and set the conditions for an environment in which we can adopt quickly, right? What does that actually look like? Well, I think about things like ubiquitous and easy access to cloud computing and unlimited compute and unlimited storage. I use this example all the time, but it shouldn't be lost on anybody in this room that a teenager with a credit card likely has more access to compute power and storage than almost any single individual at the Department of Defense. Now, when you let that sink in, you start to get actually a little bit upset about it. You're like, hey, we deserve more. That should be something that we have access to. I totally agree with you. So we need to set the conditions. We need to put in the infrastructure and the plumbing. We need to have ubiquitous access to unlimited compute, unlimited storage. The second thing that I think we need to do is we need to look at how the internet itself was built, how all the great things that came out of what we call the proverbial Silicon Valley. APIs that other companies can use to connect, add value, and extend functionality that we never imagined the day before. We never imagined. It wasn't part of a requirement. Because one day, some person, some kid who might be sitting out someplace who knows nothing about defense was like, oh, if I could consume this API and do something with that data, maybe I could do something amazing and fantastic that we never envisioned at the beginning. And that's how the internet was created. So I think we need to have open APIs that other people can consume and add value on top of. And then the last one is, I think we need to have an incredible focus on what I call continuous integration, continuous deployment, CI/CD. Software's never done. Mike, you already hit it at the beginning, right? It's not like a tank where you deliver it and you're like, this is your tank, it drives off the lot, right? In this world, the software is going to come up with new things. How can you have a world where you use artificial intelligence and machine learning if the enemy TTPs change and you can't update the model for another 18 months? We need to continually be able to deploy software at the speed of sometimes minutes or hours or days. Not every 6 months, 8 months, 24 months, right? And so I've been to certain programs where it's every 36 months, right? That's not going to work. So let's set the conditions. Those are three really simple things that I think about all the time.
Teresa, Michael, do you think that that's something that's possible?
Well, I just want to jump. Yes, I just want to jump in here because I'm at Raytheon, which many would argue is, it's a very large company. We are doing just that. So we are bringing in that digital technology, that digital thread, where we operate on software. So we're able to make not just operational decisions, but business decisions much faster. And so we know this is doable. It is practical, it is doable, and to your point, I think, Chris, necessary.
So I completely agree, but we have to reimagine these roadblocks in our way, these obstacles. You're not going to be able to do that if you maintain requirements. Think about the narcissism of requirements means we're omniscient. We know exactly what the market should build. Well, that doesn't work in the world Chris just described. It's about modularity, open interoperability, open standards, so that whatever somebody thinks of, we can incorporate that. So that requires a rethink. And as I just talked about, it requires a rethink of acquisition and budgeting so you can build that agility and speed into the process. So it's definitely possible. The commercial world shows us the way, but we have to get out of our own way in defense to make that possible. If we don't make that change, we're going to continue to live in the world we are, which is looking outside and seeing all that great innovation that we don't have access to.
Two areas of innovation we've seen in the private sector recently are cryptocurrency and metaverse, and I want to know if you could talk specifically about those. Is there a place for it in government? Do you see an applicability from private sector to government?
Well, those are not the technologies I would be focused on for defense. I just named a number of them that we do need to be focused on, and it's a pretty long list. everything from bioengineering, AI, cyber vulnerability, small drones, rapid launch capability, on and on. So I'd have a pretty long list before I got to cryptocurrency and metaverse. Yeah, but I don't know, Chris might have a
Honestly,
different view.
without focusing on crypto or metaverse, let me actually hit the basis of those, which is somewhat tying back to what I just said. Neither one of those things are inherently going to or are possible without having access to, highly distributed, unlimited amount of compute to be able to distribute workloads. So I think one way to look at it is, how did we end up as having things in a world where cryptocurrency, or we have concepts like metaverse and how we might think about those? I think that at the basis of them is still this idea that we want to have ubiquitous computing environments that we can distribute heavy amounts of workloads to accomplish a goal. The DoD doesn't have that, right? It doesn't have that. I'll say it again. A kid with a credit card can do more on a commercial cloud stack than most of the people within the Department of Defense. All vendors, all companies that want to work with the Department of Defense, guess what? They probably are deploying their stuff on commercial cloud providers. You come to the DoD and you're like, hey, I would love to work with the DoD. How do I deploy? And they're like, I have a compact Presario there in the corner running Windows 2000, right? That's what's happening. I wish that it wasn't true, but it's the reality. And so when I think about that stuff, I'm like, okay, at the basis of these things, all these new technologies we talk about, when we think about cryptocurrency, we think about metaverse, we think about even just artificial intelligence itself. All these things are going to require what doesn't exist at the DoD. So it doesn't even matter if we want to adopt them. I hear everybody ask me about how artificial intelligence and machine learning and computer vision are going to modify their mission. And I'm like, well, if you don't have an ability to update a model every 3 years, well, who cares? So it's probably going to be somebody who's sitting in a chair, writing it down, pivoting between two computers, and entering in information on two different networks. Because that's how it works today.
Despite that, when there is technology developed, one of the things that we've seen is that intellectual property being stolen by Russia, by China, and other adversaries. And so I want to ask Teresa, if I could start with you, why are we investing so much in technology just to let others steal it, and what can be done to mitigate that threat?
Yeah, so I am very excited about the new cyber leadership within the government, starting with Chris Inglis, who's the new the National Director of Cyber, Jen Easterly over at CISA. You are going to see change. You're already seeing it. And they're starting to mandate to the federal government, I think it was the largest mandate thus far, requiring federal government to patch those vulnerabilities. So we are already moving in the right direction to better protect our secrets, and we absolutely need to be able to secure those things that are just uniquely ours, that are our unique advantage. I think the second thing in the private sector, cybersecurity is a boardroom issue today. I have not met a CEO or a COO, for that matter, that doesn't know what cybersecurity is, doesn't realize that they are at risk, is worried about whether that's their IP, their intellectual property, their reputation. There's a plethora of things that they are worried about and they are spending money on. And there is lots and lots of money being spent on those capabilities that will better enable us, the tools, the systems that will better enable us to automatically protect against that, against any adversary being able to take those. But you've got to know what your most valuable assets are to protect. And I think not everything's created equal. So know what, we should all know what are those most valuable things we need to protect. The second thing I would say is you have been hacked. Act that way, behave that way, and just operate your network as if you got a bad guy in there.
Mike, I'd love to hear your perspective.
Well, I think Teresa's spot on with this, and she was really describing zero trust environment. We have to move to an environment where we're not just protecting the perimeters with ever higher castle walls. You probably have been hacked, So you need something more sophisticated, which is what Zero Trust is all about. I'd like to go back to your question about why should we invest in technology? Because it's critical if we want to maintain an advantage in this strategic competition. China sees the benefit of investing in technology, so they increase the R&D intensity of their economy and keep the economic growth. This is where the high-paying jobs are. That's why they're focused on creating the standards for industries for the next 10 or 20 years with what they call China Standards 2035, the successor to Made in China 2025. So they want to displace the US, Canada, all Western countries and companies with their own state champions, Baidu's, Alibaba's, Huawei's. They've seen how beneficial that can be with 5G, and they want to expand that across the board. We don't want to live in that world because, as we heard, their reprehensible behaviors, as was described here at the conference, they're not nice competitors in the capitalistic system either, making sure that those companies have the advantage on the world stage and garner market share because the government is behind them every step of the way. So it's critical for our way of life, our economic prosperity, that we don't just sit back and be complacent and think we have a corner on technology or innovation. If we don't invest, if we don't have the right talent, if we're not focused on the fact that this is a tech race, I've called it a superpower marathon, we're not going to be happy with the outcome.
You know, Mike, something that I think would help our audience, or certainly help me, is we've talked a lot about China and how they're operating differently. I wonder if you could walk us through it. You talked about a system in the US that takes 10 or 15 years. Can you give us a window in terms of how different a similar kind of system being developed in China would look like? I want to give our audience a sense of perspective how what you described in the beginning of today's panel would look if we were talking about the same process in China.
So I think the process for weapons developments platforms is actually pretty similar. I just saw a study this week by the RAND Corporation that looked at that. They're not 10 feet tall when it comes to developing their weapons platforms, but they don't have to work through a Congress. So when I talked about requirements and budgeting, and so their process is shortened by, they're not in a democratic process. Don't mistake me for someone who wants their system. I don't want it. But that does shorten what they do. And then the other key thing is, of course, they think about every part of the economy as an instrument of national power. They have 7 universities focused on defense. They have a civil-military fusion strategy. What does that mean? Every commercial innovation that the PLA wants, the PLA has access to. They don't need a defense innovation unit to convince companies to work with the PLA. If the government says you're working with the PLA, you're going to work with them. There's no protesting employees outside saying, well, we're not sure about the use of that. So they have brought an industrial policy that's not your Soviet Union's 5-year plans, one that brings a lot of market incentives, and I think is working for them, that's focused on technology and new national capabilities. And when required, they don't think the allocation of resources is right. We let the market determine everything. That may mean social platforms have the highest market cap. If they say, no, I don't like that, they go in and tinker with it. I'm not arguing for that system, but they are bringing all the elements of national power together to build these capabilities. The weapons platforms are kind of just the tip of the spear. It's what's going on behind that, I think, that is the key difference for them.
What's going on behind it is probably one of the most critical pieces, because when you all go home, and if you have kids, and if your kids are using TikTok, and you look at what's underneath that and how that's developed, right, we're talking about a bunch of technology that is, when you look at things like ByteDance and what they're actually creating, it is a consumer technology, but it is also a surveillance technology. It is an easy way to understand how we use artificial intelligence, machine learning, computer vision to interact with live video feeds. All of these things can be used for military operations. Don't just look at them as if they are trying to follow US industry, because it actually has China is an authoritarian capitalistic regime. It's different than how we think about it. It would be a mistake to look at it in the context of just thinking about it like Russia. And they're quite good at what they're building, and their technology isn't bad. That's the thing.
They're no longer just copying.
Yeah, we had a little bit of a discussion about this before coming out here. 10 years ago, I used to have people talk to me about China stealing technology. That's not the problem now. They already did the copy. Now they're on their own DNA. They're often building their own things, right? I made the comment to someone recently that they're going to have 5 Silicon Valleys, right? They're going to have 5. They're going to have 10. They're going to have 20, because they're investing in these areas as part of a bigger strategy for how they look at their overall state-sponsored activities that they're doing, including on the military development. So I think it's really important to focus on that, and that is the part where, when we say to ourselves, and you said, hey, they're not 10 feet tall here. Everybody in this room, we should assume every moment that they are 10 feet tall in all the areas, because that's how we're going to beat the hell out of them at what we need to do.
Let me expand on that and open the question to everyone. Then how big of a threat from all of you then do you see China in terms of its investment in artificial intelligence, alternative energy, quantum computing? You talked about thinking of it as a 10-foot man in the room, but I'm curious from all of you how you see that threat. How are you assessing those specific threats?
Well, we're losing the edge because we're not making the trade-offs that are required for the investment in talent and technology for the future. So, sure, they're not 10 feet tall, but they are focused as an entire nation, driven because they're authoritarian, by making those investments, getting the talent in place, sometimes bring the talent in from the rest of the world, the 10,000 Talents program, et cetera. They're focused on making that a reality. The China dream, the big rejuvenation of the nation headed for 2049. We need some plans that are extending out that far in terms of what capabilities we want to bring. So they may not be 10 feet tall, but neither are we. So we can't think that we can sit back, not make those investments in basic science and technology, not create the talent that we need for the economy of the next 20 or 30 years. If we don't do those things, then the advantage erodes, and pretty soon we're at a technological disadvantage. So neither is 10 feet tall, but if one organization or one country is focused and bring the resources together, which would you bet on?
Teresa, from where you sit, how would you make an assessment? I'm really curious if there are specific areas where China has been sort of particularly advantageous relative to the United States, areas of technology. I'm just curious from all of you if there's something that stands out.
Chris hit on it, surveillance technology. As a police state, as an Orwellian society, they can't be touched. It's a technological underpinning that Stalin would have only dreamed about.
Yeah, I would say, and this is about the data, it's all about the data today, and every device is generating data. Certainly with the advancements in 5G, 6G, et cetera, and the speeds of that data, it's going to be more and more readily available. And China, to Mike's point, China has access to all of that data. So I do think that is an advantage that they have over us, but they do not have an advantage over us in talent. This gets to General Nakasoni's comment earlier, and I am forever grateful to each and every person that serves in the government in whatever capacity, and those that are in the private sector that are helping the government to achieve their objectives. But we have to move the obstacles out of the way of that talent. And there are a multitude of obstacles. You've heard so much about them. We have to be able to take those risks and reward those individuals that take those risks for results. And I think Chris used the word results. We actually do need to have results, both failure of results, because you learn from your failures. The idea would be don't have too many of those failures and to have more of the successes. But I don't think we should underestimate what's inherent within our own country here and taking more advantage of that than we do today by removing obstacles.
Before I open the floor for questions, I want to ask all of you one last one, and I can't help but ask it given that we're in a pandemic. Are there areas of technology that you think that the U.S. should be investing in more, that it's not, that would more benefit Americans? I say that because, as we all know, that in a lot of ways the United States and the world, for that matter, was caught off guard by the effects of this pandemic. Are there similar areas that we need to be thinking about going forward from where you sit in terms of investing technological dollars?
Especially related to the pandemic and future pandemics. It won't be the last one. So for sure, biosecurity. We've done a tremendous thing in terms of vaccine technology, and you think about what we've done to make The supply chain, following along the panel that here earlier talked about supply chain for health, we're not putting in place what we need today, and the technology exists in the commercial world to have a global monitoring system of future pathogens. There are companies that can sequence those today. Why aren't we setting that up around the globe so that we would know first? We wouldn't be reliant on China's goodwill towards us for what they're finding. We're seeing that as soon as it happens around the world. That's possible, and we should be making that a big investment. What a terrible fate it would be to suffer through the next pandemic and not have a jump on that, and we saw what incredible damage that created.
I'll leave it there. I'd love to open the floor to questions. I'm going to take one right in front here.
Mike, hi, George Nicholson from the Global Special Operations Forces Foundation. You talked about the problem with our acquisition process. You remember back in 1964, the Lockheed Skunk Works, Kelly Johnson was given the requirement. Within 20 months, he had the aircraft flying and still holds the world's records for speed, altitude, everything else. What are lessons learned from that? Why can't that get applied to today? And the other part, the next panel on stage, you're going to have Michelle Fenoy interviewing General Clark. Senator McCain had a series of hearings on what was to fix the broken part of acquisitions. And in her testimony, one of the key points she made is the biggest problem we've got is the tyranny of consensus. To get anything done within DOD, which what we go through on that. And I remember what Lyndall Hart once said, the only thing harder than getting a new idea into the military mind is to get an old one out.
Well, I loved your question, and you hit on a number of the answers in the way you asked the question. So I would say that we need to go back to that risk-taking spirit where fewer people can make a decision. And I heard Will Roper talk about this as well in terms of how we develop next-generation aircraft dominance. It does go back to maybe we don't assume we know everything about the requirements. Let's let some of our defense primes tell us what's possible, and let's use some more flexible methods of acquisition. One thing about that requirements acquisition budgeting process, we only go as fast as the slowest cog in that system. So we've focused so much on acquisition over the past 20 or 30 years, and there are solutions there, like other transaction authority. We haven't worked on requirements or budgeting, so we've got to have the same zeal for going after those. And then your last point is right. Too many people ability to say no at the Pentagon. So how do we create more of that spirit we see in the private sector where you enable teams, you didn't want to use the empowerment word, but you got to enable teams to do their best work and take some risk and let some of them fail, but we're going to come up with a better system than assuming we know best and starting with that requirements and going through the laborious requirements acquisition budgeting process.
Can I jump in here?
Yes,
Because
please.
you went back to 1964, but I'm reading this great book by Richard Rhodes on the making of the atomic bomb. And the most fascinating thing to me about this book is those scientists that worked for years and years, they really didn't know if it was going to work at the end of the day. And when they did the test, they were all betting with each other whether it was going to work and then how well it would work. So there was risk-taking there, and it certainly can be part of our culture today if we're willing to make those changes.
Or people want to take the risk.
Right.
It's the process that's
Right.
in their way.
I'll just add on something. I think a lot about that, and I think it's interesting how much, if you were to take a step back, you can look at so many of the systems that are in place, and you would ask yourself, how in the hell did we end up with a system that works like this? There's an annual budgeting process, right? So Congress goes away, they come back with a budget, there's a budget. That's a one-year cycle, right? So people talk about that. Then you talk about programs of record, and those are probably a couple years out. We have things like POM cycles and all these things. Tell me, anybody, does any of that make sense for being able to react quickly? If you're thinking about something in 3 years, as a software engineer, I can tell you this. If I wrote C++ today and I didn't write C++ for 3 more years, it's going to be really hard, right? It's going to be like a lot of cobwebs. Every part of that is fundamentally broken, but it starts to set the conditions for why we don't move. Then you got the human capital problem, which we've talked about a little bit. We need to bring people in who are not just scientists, but software engineers and product managers. In the DoD, I used to walk around and say, hey, I ran a team a long time ago called Defense Digital Service. Say, hey, here's a person who's a product manager. And people are like, I don't even know what that is. But in the software world, they're all over the place. There's a human capital piece. And then lastly, I don't want to lose this. It's cool to build big, heavy things. I get it. It's super awesome. We should think that those are great. But if you don't get just as excited about rolling out unlimited compute and unlimited storage and continuous integration and continuous deployment and the ability to have people use APIs, I can tell you right now, none of it changes. It will not change. And you know what? It doesn't sound that exciting, but you gotta get excited about it. You should be like, hell yeah, I love APIs.
I love APIs.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
This gentleman here, please.
Hi, Paul Myler, I'm the DCM at the Australian Embassy. We made a little announcement a month ago. It was in the category of the big, hard metal things that you build. Needless to say, we're now in the phase of thinking, hearing how difficult procurement is when you're only dealing with your own team and then you add in another country. So my question is, what do we need to break now as Australia in your system that will get us subs in some sort of feasible timeline?
Let me begin by saying we have no idea what you're talking about. Mike, that seems like for you.
Well, as you probably surmised at the Defense Innovation Unit, we're not working on submarines, but I do think that your question is spot on from the standpoint of we have to find a way to work more easily and quickly with allies. So we typically have not done things on a large scale together, which is why that announcement was such a big deal. But we need to get in a rhythm of working on technology together. Standards, how do we cooperate on the research agenda, because there's too much for any one country to do. And we could use commercial as a way to do that. We could be saying, what are the commercial technologies? We had a meeting this week with the Chief Defense Scientist of Australia, who was in town, as you know, and a lot of energy about getting after it. But the getting after it in terms of what can we work on as a project together to bring that technology to our militaries requires some of the things that we talked about. We got to change the process because we have no process or system that's easy or agile to incorporate our allies. I fully believe that needs to change for the competition with China.
Yes, sir. Right here.
Thank you. John Austin. Mike, let me ask you a question. You mentioned that Google is now excited and prepared to work with the government. What's the difference between now with Maven? Is it project-oriented? What's driving that enthusiasm?
Well, fortunately, I think it's two things. One is I think they were caught flat-footed by the fact that a well-organized group of vocal protesters who are fewer number of employees than their own veteran population and families of veteran members at Google, very large company, obviously, started to dictate an agenda of activism, which I don't think the management was 100% behind, but they were flat-footed and surprised. And I'll lay some blame at the Defense Department's feet. I think we could have been more outspoken at the time about how important it is for missions to provide our intelligence analysts and military folks with capabilities so they're analyzing what they're seeing and not spending time looking at individual pixels. And anytime we can minimize any collateral damage, we should be excited about that mission as well. So I think that's changed, but I think they also see a tremendous business opportunity. Why should the Google management sit there and say no while Microsoft and Amazon are very excited about bringing unlimited compute power? The things that Chris talked about, storage, networking, Chris is absolutely right about that. If we don't have a foundation to work these issues at the Pentagon, we're going to be behind forever. So I think they see the opportunity for that, and they've recently gone through the certifications, IL4, for their platforms, and they've said, we didn't do that just for show, we want to pursue business. And let's face it, from a taxpayer standpoint, maximize competition, that's going to be the way we get value and stretch the defense dollar. So Personally, I think we need Google, we need Raytheon, we need the innovation of every small and large business in this country
Yes.
working to support the military. So I'm glad to see the change.
Chris, I'll give you the last word.
I have a message for, it isn't so much to answer your question, but I have a message to the individual who might be sitting out there watching this thinking, should I, as a software engineer, or as a person who's building a startup, is this the type of place where I want to be? And is asking if this is the type of stuff that you should be working on. Please don't wait for somebody to come save you and to build. Go build. This is the place for you. We need you. Don't wait for somebody else to go define how artificial intelligence is using and hoping that if you say, I'm not going to work on it for the DoD, that artificial intelligence will magically never be used in defense, because guess what? It will not. Be part of the solution. It's easy to look at something and to throw stones, but if you want to actually have an impact and if you want to shape the course of the future, then you show up and you get in the mission. Nobody's going to come save you. It's one of the things that I fundamentally believe. If you care about it, you show up, right? That's why I started this company with my co-founders, right? You show up and you build the future that you want. Your military, your nation needs you now more than ever before. There is no place to wonder if there's a need. I got news for you. There is a need. Show up.
You're here. Well, on that note, I can't believe how many topics we covered in such a short period of time, and I hope you'll join me in thanking our panelists for explaining them in such a thoughtful way and provoking so much insightful conversation. So please join me in thanking our panelists today. Thank you so much.